I'm now porn adjacent. I run a tabletop game stream regularly with some porn stars, which you can check out with suitable precautions in place at tabletopless.org. And just know that I put as much effort into this campaign as I would any other tits or no tits. Hello lovelies, today we're taking another look at more Iron Kingdoms RPG material. Recap. I backed the first Kickstarter, which was to produce the core rulebooks for Iron Kingdoms for 5th edition. I bet they're feeling like chumps for backing 5th edition right now, with one D&D on the horizon, but there we go. Iron Kingdoms has been through several generations. It was originally made for 3.5. It's derived from a war game with a nice simple system. Then they did their own system, which they didn't really back enough. And now they seem to have switched back to hanging on the coattails of D&D, unfortunately. But, I mean, as far as 5th edition copies, game settings, third-party material goes, it's not that bad. It's not awful, and I just love the Iron Kingdoms so much that I'm a sucker for buying it, even if I don't get to play that much. Though we did do a long campaign using their own system, which breaks at higher levels, but what games don't? Anyway, there was a second Kickstarter, and there has been a third for covering the Crix Islands, and they seem to be kind of filling in the gaps in their game world to a large degree. This stuff was Borderlands and Beyond, and it kind of covers a lot of the wild areas, some of the non-human kingdoms, like the Eosin elves, the Nis elves, the Rulian dwarves, the Scorn in the kind of desert wastelands to the east, that kind of stuff. So between this and the core set, you have now covered, albeit to a lesser degree, everything that was covered by their own game. Anyway, this pack came with a GM screen, limited use, but you know, when you're backing a bundle, you get everything. It's kind of interesting to note what different things, different games, different companies choose to put on their screens in terms of information. Given it's a game that focuses on kind of magically controlled mecha and so on, things like object damage, things like that are a little bit more important. Size categories are a little bit more important. So yeah, that information's on here. So and yeah, it's nice quality, but who doesn't produce nice quality GM screens these days? I think they all get them from the same place. Then we get an adventure. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on that. It's not a great adventure, and for all that I criticise Privateer Press for putting out a new version of the Witchblade adventures every time they do that, it is at least something different. Just maybe they shouldn't have. It suffers from the same problem that a lot of 5th edition and a lot of 4th edition preset adventures fall into, which is it's really a kind of loosely strung together series of combat encounters for the most part. You can compensate by spending more time on the more role-playing sections, but it is a bit of a whistle-stop tour for a new adventuring party around a lot of the new rules, new information. So if you're learning the game, if you're new to 5th edition, if you're new to the Iron Kingdoms, then it might be quite useful to explain in media res, as it were, the kind of the differences, the new areas, the new capabilities, the new magic, and so on. You got a miniature of the main big bad, this guy on the front, but he is largely forgettable. Can't really review adventures very well without ruining them, so I'll just leave it at that. It's okay. I personally wouldn't bother if you're an experienced GM buying the book separately. but it may have its use as a sort of tutorial and a lore guide that you play through, which can make it easier to absorb information. Wrong order. Right, so the next one that's probably worth looking at is Borderlands and Beyond, which is kind of like the player's guide for this section. And it's chock full of new rules, character options, that sort of thing. So this is where the meat is. And with this, you have, and the original set, you have all the stuff you need for characters, whether they're based on the kind of warlock beast control side or the robot controlling side. So that this creates the complete game, essentially. And you can't really complain about a lack of content on this one. It's all about going beyond the cities, beyond the more established setting. So the less humanoid species in some aspects, some degrees, the wilderness, the kingdoms of the elves, the kingdom of the dwarves. The information isn't as in deep as either the 3.5 edition or their own game system, the TTRPG system, but it's enough to be getting on with. And because they're talking about the areas that haven't been dealt with so much, there is new information in here. This does also advance the timeline, as did the previous books, beyond this weird demon war. I don't follow the war game as much, so I can't really tell you what that was all about, but no sir, I don't like it. But it's, you know, it's ignorable if you want. It doesn't seem to have massively affected the geography and the politics of the world necessarily moving into the aftermath. Details a few areas that we don't necessarily have a great deal of information on, like the Glimmerword, the troll factions that live there, and so on. Bloodstone Marches we have a bit more information on. That's where the Scorn are from, who are one of the major factions in the kind of bestial side of the game. Not a great deal of information on their culture and so on, but again, you can get that from there's like online wikis and so on. You can get more information on that or the previous books if you happen to have those. Some of those will give you a bit more information. So there is some useful background here. It doesn't go into the same kind of painstaking detail that the third edition stuff did, but yeah, it's all good. It's enough. Right. Then we get into the meat of it. So we have new racial options or species options. Bogrin are kind of like nastier, more feral versions of gobbers, which are goblins who are tinkerers in the other side. So gobbers are kind of civilized goblins. Bogrin are uncivilized goblins, if you like. Similar but different traits. The Pharaoh are pigmen that always used to be relegated to being monsters, but you can play them now. Might be a bit tricky if you go into civilization there. Marchfolk, who are sort of barbaric humans, I guess. Pigs, pygmy trolls, little trolls, to go alongside trollkin and other related species there. So they're kind of like a tribal society. It's a bit noble savagey, unfortunately, but that seems to be the only way to really acceptably tackle that kind of stuff. Elves, they have a problem. Since their gods have essentially died, more and more of them have been being born without souls. So playing an elf with no soul is now an option. I guess you have elves for everything else, and they're kind of, unfortunately, comparable with people with autism in some ways, I suppose. They're just kind of apart. Difficulties with emotions, social situations, that sort of thing. You know, the kind of thing people assign to a soul. Then you got new classes and subclasses. Bone Grinder gives you access to the kind of shamanic alchemy, making fetishes, not that kind of fetish, potions, that sort of thing. Shaman are more magic casters, users. Warlocks are the ones who can control war beasts in the same way that in the main game there are warcasters who can control the mecha of the setting. Those guys can tame and control war beasts. This creates something of a problem in tabletop, because you have a player who has to manage monsters and you have to balance encounters to take into account all the PCs and all the monsters or mecha that they have under their control. But it's such a big important part of the setting that it's not something I think you should cut out and not let players do if they want. But if you end up with people multi-classing into a warlock or warcaster, you might find yourselves in a bit of a pickle there. We have subclasses for barbarians, clerics, fighters, gunfighters, mechanics, monks, paladins, and rangers, and on into rogue, sorcerer, warcaster, and wizard. So those are all. The setting is quite detailed and deep, so it's important to have those kind of thematic tie-ins, I guess. So then we go through the various classes and what they can do. Bone Grinders are essentially, like I say, alchemists, but for more spiritual and tribal sort of things, and they have some capacity to cast spells as well. You can create talismans and all kinds of stuff from the leftovers and remnants of monsters, so that's a nice aspect to it, for it to be useful to cut up monsters and take parts of them. Very witchery, I guess. Could probably use those rules and put them over if you wanted to do a 5th edition based Witcher campaign. But there is an actual Witcher RPG, so why would you? Oh yeah, it doesn't work that great. But there we go. There's the Shaman. It's always nice to see a ribbon in a book. I wish Print on Demand had that option. Into our various domains. Warlocks are different kinds of specialization. I mean, again, this is all just kind of thematic stuff. There's not a huge amount of point going into it in fine detail here, but it's all stuff, interpretations and so on, that's more suited to the setting, and in this case particularly obviously more suited to the kind of wilderness and non-human kingdoms that we're used to. Than we used to. So here's all your usual classes: paladin, rogue, the warcasters. Those are the guys who can control the mecha, the warjacks. So we have some new options here suited to the different kingdoms, the elves and so on. The elves spent a lot of time going after wizards, who they blamed for the birth of the soulless. So, yeah, assassinating wizards is a kind of big thing for them, really. But there's no reason you can't use a lot of these classes and subclasses in the normal game as well. So, as well as being suited to the wilderness and non-human kingdoms, a lot of it has crossover possibilities for you to use. With the standard material. We have some more backgrounds. Some of these relate to troop types from the wargame, Fenblade, for example. Backgrounds don't really influence the game that much, dare I say, but it's nice to have, and it's nice to have the ones that are suited to the setting in particular. We have rules for adventuring companies, which is kind of like the same as mercenary companies from the main one. So these are all thematic. These rules have been around for a while in other games and in core 5th edition. I'm not sure exactly how I feel about it, because these things tend to give even more advantages to players who are hard enough to challenge in 5th edition anyway, but it is a nice mechanic to tie your various players together into a group and give them a common goal, at least. So yeah, there's plenty of options there. Houses and clans for different groups, different areas. Again, this is yet another set of advantages, and it's kind of separate to your adventuring company. Again, spell expansions, it's always nice to have more spells. These are all either taken from the wargame in the previous editions or added, again, thematic to the wilderness spaces or the non-human kingdoms, which is always nice to have. Some of them tie into the technology, which is nice to have again. Then we have gear. The Iosans, the elves, are more technologically advanced and sophisticated than most other groups, other than the cult of Sirius, who worship a sort of god machine. There's like a secret cult. So their technology is really cool. Elves would, in most games, typically have bows and arrows. Here you have the possibility of sniper rifles and special armor and things instead, but that maintains, it's kind of a through line of the same kind of specialities and stereotypes that you expect of elves, but taken in a much more technological sort of direction. Again, which is nice. The dwarves have their own sort of squat, stumpy mining steamjacks, so those are kind of covered. Again, a lot of this is taken from the war game, but it's all interesting, and a lot of the gear can be taken around. The elves, their warjacks are called myrmidons, and again they're more technologically sophisticated than those found in the Iron Kingdoms themselves, so you need to have those, and they're interesting. Less transferable than the Rulik steamjacks, but yeah, good enough. And again, you have a lot of weird high-tech stuff. It's almost like you dropped the Eldar into a game of Warhammer Fantasy in some ways, but not quite as technologically domineering. War beasts, these are what the kind of warlocks control here, in place of steamjacks. And we have some basic NPCs, some of them again based on the war game and so on, so it's nice to see those familiar elements brought across into the RPG. But with your own system it was a lot easier to transfer things. But that's not so much monsters as NPCs and animals that you might find around. If you want monsters, you more need the Borderlands Survival Guide. This is more like the Dungeon Master's book, the Games Master's book, for the same part of the setting. So this again addresses the wildlands and the non-human areas, and it's more optional rules and Games Master assistance. So there's rules for customizing equipment, which in a technologically based game is something you definitely want, and this expands on and moves wider than the rules for creating mechanica and so on in the core books, in the Iron Kingdoms part of the setting. Combine the two and you can end up with some really deadly stuff, and I'm not entirely convinced, given the kinds of rewards that adventurers can reap, that these prices are necessarily high enough or compound enough, but still it's nice to have. So that is there. They got a simplified way of tracking the amount of fuel and so on that your steamjacks use. So instead of keeping track of every lump of coal, every pound of coal, instead you have a certain number of coal dice that you can burn up and use in the operation of your steamjacks, and which you can use more fuel to boost things. Now that's a nice and interesting option for things to do. And you could also hypothetically, I guess, create stronger, more powerful fuel in certain ways, which would be a bit like putting the special coal in the steam engine in Back to the Future, right? So that could be interesting to add in, and that would be easy to mod and do. We have some diseases which are neglected in a lot of 5th edition, and they don't really seem that effective in a lot of 5th edition. This stuff seems a bit more deadly and gritty. In fact, all of this Iron Kingdoms material, whether it be the core set or this Borderlands and Beyond set, would all be improved by using a grittier 5e rule set, such as my own Grimdark, he said, shamelessly plugging his material. It will make it feel much more like the Iron Kingdoms if you use a grittier, nastier, more deadly rule set. We have some more backgrounds. That's related to the disease side of things, so an order of doctors, new rules for curing things, the effectiveness of pharmaceuticals, again something neglected in a lot of 5th edition material because magic. But we have magic and technology here working together. Expanded ideas on environmental hazards and new thematically appropriate environmental hazards, which is usable in lots of other games. Very useful that way. Particular problems that you might find in particular areas, like the Glimmerwood, Ios, other areas, the deserts. Expanded or improved rules, I would say, on the kind of environmental hazards that you might run into. There's a new rule called Effort, which is an optional kind of swap in place of inspiration. You can hold up to 3 points of effort, and then you can exert that effort to do more heroics. You can use it in the same way as an inspiration roll. You can spend a point to delay a death saving roll, to give yourself an extra attack. Heroic dodge, bonus actions, run gun, shaky condition, have a stroke of luck, walk off a wound. They're a bit easier to gain than inspiration and so on. And even if you're a close-knit team, to spend effort points to aid others in the group, so to give them a bonus on their rolls. It's yet more stuff that gives yet more advantage to the player characters, which is something I'm very wary of doing in 5th edition normally, but as an optional rule, if you maybe ramp up the difficulty or use one of the darker, grittier rules modifications for 5th edition, then that might be okay. Alternative rules for healing, again, which is nice to have. Different complications that can happen, limits on how much healing clerics and so on can do. It all seems like a bit too much bookkeeping to me, but it is important to drive home how different healing is within the Iron Kingdoms. Drugs and poisons, another overlooked area in 5th edition, I think, but they go into a nice amount of detail here. Stress, which is a different way of handling fear effects, madness, that sort of thing. Of course, we have to have a disclaimer. As someone with mental health issues, I just find that patronising and annoying. Again, this seems like more complicated bookkeeping than you necessarily need for an RPG, but if you want to play up that side, if you want to bring in that grittier part, then again, the swapping in those rules could be okay. Guidelines for creating adventures in the Borderlands, the main themes that are kind of baked into the material. If you're an experienced DM, you don't really need this kind of thing, but it's nice to have the ideas there anyway. It might spark an idea for you. If you're a noob, much more useful. But if you're a noob trying to tackle the Iron Kingdoms and you're not already grounded in the war game or some other aspect of it, I think there's been a couple of computer games, and you're going to have a hard time regardless, unfortunately. It's one of those deep lore kind of games that's you gain a lot more by understanding more about the setting and everything. Kind of like Warhammer 40,000, you get a lot more out of it if you know what's going on. Magic items and treasures found in the area. Yeah, it's always nice to have more things there. Variety is the spice of life, or the spice of your bag of holding, I suppose. The Eldritch are now here as an option. They're kind of undead elves. Yeah, it's all a bit 90s high gothic to me. Mortar theurgy is something that the Scorn do, so through harming themselves in a lot of ways and doing other weird things to do with death and torture and pain, they get access to magic. So you have your spell list and your options there. I don't know that I would necessarily allow either of those in a game. It would depend very much on the theme and the setting, but fitting either of those things into a regular gaming group is going to be incredibly difficult. We have a nice bestiary with plenty of new creatures and monsters for players to fight, and they're all thematically appropriate to the areas in which we find ourselves, and expand upon the NPCs and the animals that we find more in the player's guide side. So yeah, all incredibly useful. We can always use more monsters, unfortunately, because that's one of those things with class and level systems, is monsters rapidly get outstripped by the players to the point where they don't become even a slight obstacle anymore. But we do have more NPC types as well, and some things that kind of bridge the gap between NPCs and monsters. These are all arranged by theme and so on, which is kind of good when constructing adventures, less good when you're trying to look stuff up, I would say. And that is about it, I believe. Yes, it is. So, what do we reckon then? A GM screen is a GM screen. You don't need any further opinions on that. Shadow of the Seeker, the adventure. Style 3 for production quality. Substance a low 2. So 5 out of 10, 2.5 out of 5. Very, very average, and most of that is just that it looks kind of pretty, because they always have good art. Borderlands and Beyond, the sort of player's guide side. Style 4. Some layout issues, which is the case with both books, but it's very pretty looking, very inspiring, makes you want to play. Substance 4, so it's 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5. If you're interested in the Iron Kingdoms, that's kind of essential, alongside the main core books. Borderlands Survival Guide, Style 4, Substance 5. There is a lot in here, a lot of alternate rules, even if you might not use them. It's always useful to have your expectations and your thoughts kind of pricked a little to see if they stand up to scrutiny. So Style 4, Substance 5, 9 out of 10, 4.5 out of 5. Again, recommended, probably essential if you're going to run a 5e Iron Kingdoms game, which hopefully I will get to do at some point. And that's it. Zang. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.